Parting Glances is a 1986 film that stars Richard Ganoung, John Bolger, Steve Buscemi, and Kathy Kinney. It is highly regarded in LGBTQ+ cinema for its realism. Director Bill Sherwood said he felt dismay at the way gays are always portrayed in movies and wanted to create something featuring nice, normal gay people for a change. He described his efforts as a love letter to the gay culture of then present-day New York. Parting Glances is set to a soundtrack combining the director's passion for classical music and synth pop. In addition to directing, Sherwood also wrote and edited the film. It was shot on a low budget of $330,000 acquired from friends and acquaintances, just under $887,000 today when adjusted for inflation. The film grossed $537,681 in the US and Canada, or about $1.4 million in today's money. The actors employed were non-union and largely unknown. Steve Buscemi and Kathy Kinney being the exception, they are still all relatively unknown today. Vito Russo, author of The Celluloid Closet, best described the story as nothing happens and everything happens. The story takes place over a tense and emotional yet very casual 24-hour period as the three main characters each find ways to avoid and come to terms with one's impending decline. The film opens with a couple, Michael, an editor, and Robert, who works for a health organization. They've been together for 6 years. However, there is some tension between the two. Tomorrow, Robert will be leaving for a 2-year stint in Africa, while Michael will be staying behind in New York. However, Michael has more than just Robert's impending departure on his mind. During the day, Michael goes to a record store to buy an album for his best friend Nick, a musician. The record store cashier, Peter, flirts with him. Michael is taken aback by Peter's forwardness, but nevertheless extends an invitation for Peter to attend Robert's going-away party that night. He leaves the record store to visit Nick. Michael prepares food for Nick, and they discuss the importance of Nick's health, as well as Robert's absence from the visit. Robert hasn't come to see him since Nick was diagnosed with AIDS. Michael leaves Nick's and goes to a dinner party with Robert, hosted by Robert's boss Cecil and his partner Betty. Michael believes that Cecil engineered the transfer, but on the taxi ride home, Robert admits that the transfer was actually his idea. He was given the ultimate decision and decided to go through with it.
I want to leave because it's gotten too settled. Predictable.
Michael is frustrated that Robert is just telling him this now. Nick is brought up during their argument.
You know, every time you go over to visit Nick, you come back mean as shit.
Just stop bringing up Nick. He's got nothing to do with any of this.
He's always in there somewhere.
They make up once at home, with Michael convincing Robert to go through with their plans and to attend Joan's going-away party she's orchestrated for him. At the party, they catch up with old friends, including Terry, Douglas, for whom Michael is editing a book, and Sarah, who is an ex-girlfriend and close friend of Robert's. Also at the party are Klaus and Lisa Lott, mixed media performance artist Joan has invited to stay with her. Peter, the record store clerk from earlier, also attends the party. He continues to flirt with Michael even after learning of his relationship with Robert. Soon after, Nick arrives, having decided to go after initially vehemently deciding against it. He is greeted by Michael, Joan, and Terry. Everyone else treats him with a disdainful distance. Klaus even objectifies him. He soon after decides to leave, only to be stopped by Peter, who is asking for advice on how to win over Michael. As the party ends, Michael and Terry take Robert to a gay club, thus ending the night. The next morning, Michael and Robert return home by cab. Michael, upset that Robert ditched him at the club during their last night together, takes Robert's keys and runs off. When Robert catches up, Michael confronts him.
You're leaving because you don't want to be around when Nick dies. You don't want to deal with me going through that.
Robert reassures Michael that he loves him, but reiterates that he needs time away. He also says Michael needs to spend more time with Nick, and that he, Robert, has been getting in the way. At the airport, Michael pushes Robert to hurry so he doesn't miss his plane. Robert comes back to give him a final hug before going inside. Michael then visits Nick, who is talking on the phone with his lawyer, trying to convince him he can go on tour. Nick's frustrations continue to build after being hung up on. He finally grabs a glass and shatters it. Michael grabs an object off the top of the fridge, ready to smash it, but Nick stops him and gives him a plate instead. They smash all of the plates in the kitchen, dancing around on the broken shards. Once it's over, Nick makes a few allusions to his upcoming death. Nick tells him they should have left New York as soon as they met. Then Michael confesses to Nick about how he really feels.
Not fair. You've been in love a bunch.
Just once, really.
Okay. Now he's gone, right?
He's right here.
He points and nods at Nick, unable to get more words out. He pulls him into a tender hug and silently cries on his shoulder. Michael returns home and daydreams of Nick when they were younger. Meanwhile, Nick takes a train, then a boat out onto Fire Island. Once there, he calls Michael to tell him where he's at. He tells him he can't take it anymore. This is it. He hangs up the phone with a smirk. Michael, fearing the worst, rushes to call an air taxi company to fly him out on the island. The door then unlocks. Robert appears in the doorway. He sneaks up to Michael, frantically speaking on the phone. Robert expects Michael to be happy to see him, but Michael is only concerned about Nick. Robert tells him he decided to stay. He's not going to Africa. Michael tells him to hold that thought. He rushes out, but turns around to give Robert a kiss before finally leaving. On the island, he runs down to the beach upon spotting Nick. Nick is smoking a cigarette and calmly gazing at the ocean. Michael asks him, "Are you okay?" To which Nick says,
Yeah, I'm fine.
Michael is irritated, having rushed onto the island for what he thought would be an emergency. Nick, indifferent to Michael's frustration, says to Michael, "Let's take a trip." Flashbacks of them running down to the same beach intersplice with the present day. Michael says he's exhausted and just wants to go home.
Hold up your arm and point.
He tells him to close his eyes and spin. Wherever he lands is where they will go. Michael gives in, and Nick spins him. He spins and spins. When he stops, he's pointing at Nick. Nick looks up to Michael's hand, then his face, then behind himself.
Europe's too foofy. How about we visit Robert in Africa?
There is a final shot of the park, and then the credits roll. Before we get into any possible interpretations of the ending, I want to analyze some of the characters, Nick in particular. But before I even do that, let's take a look at the historical context of this film. New York City in the 1980s. Crime and drug use were high. The economy was booming, as was the world of contemporary art. And cases of an immunodeficiency disease were on the rise. A rare lung infection called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or PCP, and a rare cancer called Kaposi sarcoma, or KS, among other opportunist infections, were suddenly becoming increasingly more common among gay men. The CDC publishes the first article on the phenomenon on June 5, 1981. Before long, this disease would be dubbed the gay cancer. Hundreds of gay men were rapidly dying with no explanation as to how or why. On September 24, 1982, the CDC officially gave this immunodeficiency disease a name: AIDS. Harmful rumors spread. Because the public believed only gay men could catch the disease, and because homophobia was still rampant, it wasn't initially treated as the crisis it should have been. When coverage grew, fear was high. So was blame. Ignorance arose from homophobia, some saying that gay people deserved it or had brought it upon themselves. Some even claimed it was an act of God, punishing them for their sinful way of life. Meanwhile, members of the gay community helplessly watched their friends and partners slowly succumb to death. The care of people with AIDS was left up to volunteers, many of whom were lesbians. LGBTQ+ groups and individuals took it upon themselves to raise both awareness and funding for the treatment of people with AIDS. By May 1983, nearly half of the people among the reported cases had died. Congress would not approve dedicated funding for AIDS treatment and research until July of that year. In 1984, the cause of AIDS would be identified as HIV, as well as all the major transmission routes. By the end of the year, over 3,500 of the diagnosed 7,700 plus had passed away from complications. United States leaders largely chose to not speak of HIV/AIDS. In October of 1982, President Reagan's press secretary, Larry Speakes, was questioned by journalist Lester Kinsolving. Kinsolving called the disease the gay plague, causing an eruption of laughter in the press pool. In September of 1985, after 5,636 AIDS-related deaths, President Reagan finally broke his silence. Despite calling AIDS a top priority, he defended the administration's response. In January of 1986, 1 month before Parting Glance's release, the CDC reported that there were more people diagnosed with AIDS in 1985 than in the previous years combined. Of all the AIDS cases, 51% of adults and 59% of children had died. At this point, people with AIDS were expected to live about 15 more months from the date of diagnosis. This is the world Parting Glances takes place in. However, one of Parting Glance's most notable aspects is its realism. AIDS is not the central focus of the film. It's the relationship between the characters. Nick is ultimately the heart of the movie. The movie doesn't begin with him, but it ends with him. Nick is wild. He recounts tearing the town apart with Michael in their youth. He's witty and has a wry sense of humor. It is unknown to the audience how long he has had AIDS, although he's likely only known for about a month or two at most. It's also unclear how much of his behavior is derived from his diagnosis, specifically his dark humor and bleak outlook. He's angry that he has it and how others view him for having it, but he has also come to a place of accepting death. He knows he's going to die and makes no effort to limit the effects of the disease. He resists and resents the treatments that are supposed to help him live longer. In his words, he believes it to be bullshit. However, he subjects himself to drinking green concoctions for Michael's sake. He tells Joan that if it wasn't for Michael making him, he wouldn't eat at all. When Michael isn't around, though, he partakes in sugary soft drinks and beer and smokes cigarettes. Michael tries to be a positive voice for Nick when Nick's humor turns especially dark. Michael doesn't find it funny when Nick tells him which of his possessions he'll inherit when he dies. He doesn't expect himself to live very long. Greg, a friend of his, only lived for 6 months after his diagnosis. Michael counteracts this by saying Greg didn't take proper care. He tries to encourage Nick, telling him that France is working on a new drug. Nick then counteracts Michael, saying the drug likely won't come out until the year 2000. Having AIDS is not Nick's fault. He knows this. Michael knows this, and so does Joan. In his video Will, he says when he heard about AIDS going around, he stopped cold, but it had already been too late. It was long before he knew he had it, due to the long gestation period. He wants to make it clear that he wasn't some kind of gonzo kamikaze dick. This, however, is what Robert believes. Robert says that Nick knew what was going around, yet he still went right on trashing it up. He asserts that having AIDS is Nick's fault. Nick and Robert are not fond of one another, although why is never stated. Nick takes any opportunity to call Robert names. He jumps at an opportunity to inconvenience him and initially intends to leave him a large via the video Will. He doesn't understand how his ex-boyfriend and best friend fell for a guy like Robert. Even still, Nick is bitter that Robert hasn't visited him since the diagnosis, even the day before when Robert is preparing to leave for the next 2 years. He sees the reasons of can't deal with illness and still packing as pitiful excuses for Robert's avoidance. Both of them know that Nick will not be around when Robert returns. When Robert, drunk, late at night, finally decides to call Nick to say goodbye, apologizing for not doing so earlier, Nick nonchalantly says, "That's cool." He doesn't express how much it has hurt him to have been avoided. This isn't something he only experiences from Robert. At Joan's party, Douglas stiffens when Nick touches him. Douglas's sidekick eyes Nick in a similar manner. When Nick jokingly tells Douglas, "Hey, looking trim," Douglas takes the opportunity to say, "So are you." Nick, likely having lost weight because of his illness, purses his lips, slaps Douglas on the back, and leaves. He goes up to another old friend who patronizingly tells him he is sorry to hear that he is ill and he'll pray for him. Nick, unimpressed, replies, "Thanks, I'll pray for you too." Even Nick's lawyer treats him like a pariah. He doesn't want Nick to go on tour with his band, fearful that Nick will drop dead in the middle of it. Nick doesn't want to be viewed as an AIDS victim. He doesn't want to be defined by his illness or for it to be the first thing people think about him. At Joan's party, Nick is continuously reminded of his situation. Peter misinterprets what Nick means when he says Michael is cautious. Peter says, "If he's worried about catching you know what, it won't be from me." Nick says, "That's not what I meant." Later, when Peter apologizes, Nick dismisses him, saying, "Forget it." He decides to leave shortly after Klaus requests that Nick be a part of a performance featuring only terminally ill people. Klaus equates Nick with AIDS. He doesn't see Nick as an individual. He objectifies him and trivializes his declining health. Nick, in response to Klaus viewing impending death as a performance, sneaks up, puts him in a headlock, and pulls a switchblade on him. He has Klaus beg for his life. All Klaus can say in response is, "Don't." Nick releases him and tells him it was a good performance. He agrees to do something for Klaus's next piece on one condition. Klaus gets Joan her own gallery show. Something that sticks out about Nick is his kindness and his generosity. He is willing to subject himself to a mockery in exchange for getting his friend a long-awaited art show that she has worked so hard for. He leaves generous amounts of money for his friends in his will, Michael getting the most. The remainder of his money is to go to the GMHC for the care of impoverished people with AIDS. He is adamant that the money not go to medical research. His thought process is that if the feds can spend $1 trillion on bombs, then they can spend a little on research. Nick can come across as a bit of a conspiracy theorist, reciting news he read in Village Voice. He alludes to AIDS being Africa's last laugh on us. However, his dissatisfaction with the United States government is well-founded, considering its response to the AIDS epidemic. His conversation with Peter shows he's disillusioned by the American dream. When Peter says he wants a simple life, which includes a BMW and a house in a wealthy neighborhood, Nick responds, "Next thing you're gonna tell me is you're a fucking Republican." He is turned off by Peter's extreme patriotism, which leads him to the conclusion that Peter is definitely a Republican. The conversation with Peter puts Nick in an awkward position, not because of Peter's naivete and disillusionment, but because Peter is asking Nick for advice on how to get Michael. Peter tells him that Michael often comes to the record store to buy opera albums. He doesn't realize that the record store trips are to buy gifts for Nick. Michael and Nick are best friends, but they are also former lovers. At the party, Michael tells Joan, "I'm even more whacked out than Nick. That's why it never could have worked." He tells her, "With Nick, I don't know where he leaves off and I begin." Two sides of the same coin. Their similarities are heightened when they're together. They're both witty and sarcastic, often reflecting each other's energy. Unlike Michael with Robert, there aren't any hidden jabs of anger between Michael and Nick, even when the two don't agree. They are rather playful with one another, never with any malintent, and never at one's expense. It is unclear exactly why they broke up, perhaps relating back to when Nick described Michael as cautious when it came to dating. With both being so wild in their youth and their very similar personalities, it's possible the relationship was just too intense. Perhaps foreseeing a disastrous ending, they decided being friends would be better than being lovers. It is clear, however, that they never stopped caring for one another. More so, they never stopped loving one another. In the first scene that Michael and Nick are in together, they arm wrestle. Michael lets Nick win the first time. At Nick's request for a rematch, Michael pins him. Michael then takes Nick's hand and pulls him forward to sit on his lap. Nick mutters something while covering his mouth. The words, "I love you." Michael asks him what he said, to which Nick responds, "I didn't say anything." They go back and forth, all the while looking from each other's eyes to their lips. Their friendship has lasted for 10 years. Despite Michael being in a relationship with Robert, the only person he's ever truly loved is Nick. Michael is also Nick's only love. Michael reveals to Joan that he's always loved Nick more than Robert. Joan says he better tell him. The next day, after Robert leaves, Michael does this, letting Nick know he is the only person he's ever loved. The album Michael buys for Nick is Mozart's Don Giovanni. Much like Parting Glances, Don Giovanni combines comedy with serious drama. In the movie, Nick is shown listening to the finale. The liner notes translate what is occurring. The statue, being the Commendatore, sings, "Repent, change your ways, for this is your last hour." Don Giovanni replies, "No, no, I will not repent, leave me be." They go back and forth arguing. "Repent, scoundrel." "No, you old fool. Repent. No. All your time is up." The camera pans to an image of the statue of the Commendatore. Not long after, Nick sees something. A figure resembling the Commendatore is standing in the hall. He blinks, and it disappears. The vision leads him to head over to Joan's apartment for Robert's going-away party. The second time he sees it is later in the night after Robert's phone call. Echoing the Commendatore from the opera, he says, "Repent! Repent!" Nick, like Don Giovanni, adamantly replies, "No!" Instead of condemning Nick to die, the Commendatore tells him instead to live as long as he can. Nick's Commendatore, in the form of his old friend Greg, tells him, "Heaven's real boring." Although Nick is seemingly agnostic, the inclination of Nick going to heaven directly contrasts with Don Giovanni being sent to hell. This reinstates that there is no real reason for Nick to repent. He hasn't done anything wrong. As Don Giovanni killed the Commendatore, it could be possible that Nick feels responsible in some way for Greg's death, but it is not likely that this is the case. Repent echoes the sentiments of those like Robert and the American public, who believe Nick is at fault for his illness. However, repenting would not save Nick, even if he had something to repent for. It is not known how long he has left, but he knows his death is inevitable. For Nick, the Commendatore represents his impending death, but more importantly, it represents how much time he has left. The visions of the Commendatore encourage Nick to live. He says, "Hang on as long as you can." Nick whispers, "Okay." The Commendatore adds some final advice. "If you go on a trip, make sure you take..." But he never finishes. It is with this vision that Nick's outlook seemingly changes. He agrees to hang on as long as he can, and he decides to go on a trip, taking with him the most important person in his life. In the final scene, Nick spins Michael, telling him that wherever he lands is the direction they will go. The movie is largely from Michael's point of view. His daydreams and flashbacks have shown to always contain Nick from years past. The images of Nick seem to be drawn to Michael's affection and love for him, and how much he will miss these moments when he is gone. However, when he spins, an image of Robert crops up, fast asleep. This, however, is not a memory. Robert's same shirt and tie indicate that this is happening while Michael is spinning, or perhaps could even be what Michael imagines Robert to be doing at that exact moment. Assuming Robert really is sleeping at this moment, it shows his lack of concern for Nick's well-being, Michael having just voiced his concerns to him. Even while Michael is telling him what is happening, his responses show limited sympathy. It's possible that he thinks Nick is just being dramatic, but there is even a lack of concern for how Michael is feeling. While his boyfriend is rushing off trying to catch up with his best friend before it's too late, Robert takes a nap. In a more metaphorical sense, it could be a reflection of Robert and Michael's relationship, reflecting Robert's earlier desire to take a break, and Michael's admittance that he's only ever loved Nick. Coming back much earlier than expected is sure to cause tension among the trio, Robert even stating just earlier that morning that he was getting in the way of Michael and Nick's friendship, and encouraging Michael to spend more time with Nick. When Michael finally stops spinning, he's pointing at Nick. Michael is wholly aware of this. On the other hand, it is unclear with Nick. Does he realize this and play it off, or is he totally oblivious to the possible interpretations? The film doesn't make it clear what the meaning of this moment is, other than being symbolic of Michael's relationship with Nick. It could mean, and likely means, that Michael will be staying with Nick and spending more time with him. It's hard to imagine anything else. Maybe they will go to Africa or Europe or Wisconsin, or maybe they won't go anywhere and take a trip has more of a metaphorical meaning to it. Regardless of where they go, Nick is the predetermined destination. Nick, deciding that they should go visit Robert in Africa, inherently asks the question, what will Nick's reaction be when Michael tells him Robert didn't go? How is Robert going to fit into this newfound situation when his absence has already been accepted? Michael was not pleased to see him return, albeit he had other things on his mind. One can imagine that Nick won't be too hyped about it either. Robert, while saying that Michael needs to spend more time with just Nick, still decides to come back. Is it out of his love for Michael, deciding he will support him when Nick's time comes? He is shown throughout the film to project his avoidance onto Michael. So is his return a form of avoidance of the possible consequences if he leaves? Or is it an acceptance of his relationship with Michael and Michael's with Nick, of Nick's impending death and Michael's impending suffering? The film essentially begs the question of what will happen to these characters when the credits start rolling. Buscemi was revered for his role in Parting Glances. He was a favorite of both audience members and critics alike. The production company liked him so much they put him on the movie's poster. He also seems to have been a favorite of Sherwood's. The film helped Buscemi get an agent and more roles came his way, but it wouldn't be until 1992 that he really broke out into the mainstream with Reservoir Dogs. He would later go on to do many highly acclaimed films, including Monsters, Inc., The Death of Stalin, and Fargo. Kathy Kinney would go on to have a lead role in The Drew Carey Show. She has had many small roles and guest star roles in various sitcoms, some of which include Seinfeld, Full House, Grace Under Fire, Boy Meets World, and My Name is Earl, and has frequently collaborated with Drew Carey in other programs. John Bolger has had roles in 3 different series in the Law & Order franchise, as well as repeating roles in soap operas including Guiding Light, Loving, Another World, and General Hospital. He has also had starring roles in smaller sitcoms and drama series. Richard Ganoung has a limited amount of film credits. He has a small role in another independent gay romantic comedy, Billy's Hollywood Screen Kiss. He also lent his voice talents to the 1980 Astro Boy series, playing Astro Boy's father. Bill Sherwood passed away on February 10, 1990, of complications from AIDS, nearly 4 years to the day from when Parting Glances was released. Parting Glances would be his only finished film. One can only speculate about the influence he would have continued to have. In 2007, the UCLA Film and Television Archive and Outfest released a restored print of the film as the first part of the Outfest Legacy Project. The 4 lead actors, Ganoung, Bolger, Buscemi, and Kinney, have maintained their support of the film and Sherwood's legacy. And although the movie took place during a tumultuous time in gay history, often being credited as the first film to tackle the AIDS crisis, Bolger and Buscemi, both straight, and Ganoung, who is gay, took their roles without any qualms, offering their talents to a movie that would go on to impact countless people. I have linked many sources down below, many of which are for further reading if you are interested in learning more about the movie and the things that inspired it. There are so many great little write-ups by fans and interviews with the cast that I encourage you to check out. I also linked some sources that provide more context of the film and the time it was created. This video is a little more serious than my typical videos, but if you're interested in seeing more videos like this or my other ones, I ask you to consider subscribing to my channel as well as liking and leaving a comment. This video has been a year in the making and I am so glad to have finally been able to create it and upload it. I sincerely thank you for watching.